What if I told you that right now, at this very moment, you are sitting inside an invisible fortress, a fortress so powerful, so perfectly engineered, that without it, every single cell inside your body would be under relentless attack from forces you cannot see, cannot hear, and cannot feel. That fortress is not your house. It is not your city. It is not even your country. That fortress is the planet Earth itself. And the moment you leave it, the moment you truly leave it, not just float a few 100 kilometers above it like astronauts on the International Space Station, but actually venture out into the deep black void between the planets, something terrifying begins to happen. Your body, the most complex biological machine ever known, begins to fall apart, not metaphorically, not symbolically. Literally, your bones begin to dissolve, your muscles begin to waste away, your heart begins to shrink, your eyeballs change shape, your brain swells, your DNA starts to break, and there is not a single piece of technology on this planet right now, not one that can fully stop it. Now, here is a question that might keep you up tonight. Since the year 1972, since the very last Apollo mission, Apollo 17, not a single human being has traveled beyond low Earth orbit. Not one. In over 50 years of technological advancement, in an era where we carry supercomputers in our pockets and can video call someone on the other side of the world in real time, not a single human has gone beyond the protective magnetic bubble of our planet. Why? With all the money, all the engineering, all the ambition, why has no space agency on Earth sent a human back into deep space for more than half a century? The answer is not about rockets. The answer is not about fuel. The answer is about biology. The answer is about what deep space does to the human body. And today, we are going to go through every single detail of that answer. Before we go any further, let me share some facts with you. These are not theories. These are not estimations. These are measured, documented, peer-reviewed scientific facts. Fact number 1. On the International Space Station, astronauts experience 16 sunrises and 16 sunsets every single day because the station orbits Earth once every 90 minutes. 16 times a day the sun rises, 16 times a day the sun sets. This completely destroys the human biological clock. Fact number 2. The temperature in space swings from plus 250 degrees Fahrenheit in direct sunlight to minus 250 degrees Fahrenheit in shadow. That is a 500-degree difference, and the transition between the two can happen almost instantaneously as a spacecraft rotates from sunlight into shadow. Fact number 3. If you were exposed to the vacuum of space without a suit, the water in your body tissues would begin to vaporize, not from heat, but from the absence of pressure, a process called ebullition, and your body would swell to roughly twice its normal size. Fact number 4. A single high-energy cosmic ray particle, something smaller than an atom, can pass through the walls of a spacecraft, pass through your skull, and destroy thousands of neurons in a straight line, like a microscopic bullet tearing through your brain tissue. And there is no shielding material currently in existence that can reliably stop it. Fact number 5. Astronaut Scott Kelly, after spending just 1 year on the International Space Station, which is still inside Earth's magnetic protection, came back to Earth with altered gene expression, thickened retinas, cognitive fog, changes to his DNA, and shifts in his gut bacteria that persisted for months after landing, 1 year inside Earth's protection. Fact number 6. A mission to Mars would expose astronauts to radiation equivalent to roughly 12,000 chest X-rays, delivered continuously over 2.5 years, and there is currently no technology that can fully shield them from it. These facts are just the beginning. What I am about to take you through is the complete, exhaustive, system-by-system breakdown of how deep space attacks the human body. This is not science fiction. This is not speculation. Every single thing I will tell you is based on real NASA research, real European Space Agency studies, real peer-reviewed medical journals, and real astronaut experiences. If you are the kind of person who genuinely wants to understand the real science behind space exploration, not the Hollywood version, not the simplified version, but the deep, unfiltered truth, then stay with me, because this is going to be a journey unlike anything you have experienced on this channel before. And if you find value in this kind of deep, research-driven content, take 1 second right now to hit that subscribe button and tap the like icon. Because content like this takes hundreds of hours to research and produce, and your support is what makes it possible. Now, let us begin at the very beginning. What exactly do we mean by deep space? This is important because not all of space is equally dangerous. When most people think of astronauts in space, they think of the International Space Station. The ISS orbits Earth at an altitude of roughly 400 kilometers. That sounds high, and it is, but in cosmic terms, it is barely off the surface. To put it in perspective, if Earth were the size of a basketball, the ISS would be orbiting less than 1 centimeter above the surface. It is still firmly wrapped within Earth's magnetic field, still protected by the magnetosphere. Deep space is something fundamentally different. The International Telecommunication Union defines deep space as beginning at a distance of 2 million kilometers from the Earth's surface, NASA's Deep Space Network. The communication system used to talk to interplanetary probes operates on a similar definition, roughly anything beyond 2 million kilometers, which is about 5 times the distance from the Earth to the Moon. At that distance, you have left the protective embrace of Earth's magnetic field entirely. You are exposed to the raw, unfiltered environment of interplanetary space. And that environment is lethal. To understand why deep space is so different from low Earth orbit, you need to understand what protects you right now at this very moment. Deep beneath your feet, roughly 2,900 kilometers below the surface, lies Earth's outer core, a churning ocean of liquid iron and nickel, heated to temperatures between 4,000 and 6,000 degrees Celsius. This liquid metal is in constant convective motion, circulating in complex patterns driven by Earth's rotation and internal heat. This motion generates something extraordinary, an enormous magnetic field that extends tens of thousands of kilometers into space, forming a structure called the magnetosphere. The magnetosphere is shaped somewhat like a teardrop, compressed on the side facing the sun, and stretched into a long tail on the opposite side. On the sunward side, it extends roughly 65,000 kilometers. On the tail side, it stretches millions of kilometers. This magnetic cocoon is your primary shield against the deadly radiation that floods interplanetary space. Within the magnetosphere, there are 2 particularly important structures called the Van Allen radiation belts, discovered in 1958 by physicist James Van Allen using data from the Explorer 1 satellite. The inner belt sits between roughly 1,000 and 6,000 kilometers above Earth's surface and is populated primarily by high-energy protons. The outer belt extends from roughly 13,000 to 60,000 kilometers altitude and contains mainly high-energy electrons. These belts are regions where charged particles from the solar wind and cosmic rays are trapped by Earth's magnetic field, bouncing back and forth along magnetic field lines. They are themselves hazardous to pass through, which is why Apollo missions were carefully routed through thinner sections, and the astronauts passed through them as quickly as possible, spending roughly 30 minutes in the most intense regions. But the Van Allen belts also serve a purpose. They are part of the system that prevents these particles from reaching Earth's surface. Beyond the magnetosphere, in the space between the planets, there are 2 primary sources of radiation that make deep space so extraordinarily dangerous. The first is galactic cosmic rays, abbreviated GCR. These are high-energy particles that originate not from our Sun, but from violent events across the Milky Way galaxy, primarily supernovae, the colossal explosions of dying stars. Galactic cosmic rays consist mostly of protons, about 87%, helium nuclei, about 12%, and a small but devastatingly important fraction of heavier nuclei called HZE particles, which stands for high atomic number Z and high energy. That remaining roughly 1% of heavy ions includes nuclei of elements like carbon, oxygen, silicon, and iron, stripped of their electrons and accelerated to velocities approaching the speed of light, carrying enormous kinetic energy. The energy of these particles can exceed 10 billion electron volts per nucleon. To put that in perspective, a single iron nucleus in a galactic cosmic ray, something far too small to see, carries roughly the kinetic energy of a baseball thrown at 60 miles per hour, concentrated into a space smaller than an atom. When one of these particles hits your body, it does not just damage one cell, it tears through tissue like a hot needle through wax, leaving a trail of ionization and destruction that can extend through your entire body. And here is the truly frightening part about galactic cosmic rays. You cannot effectively shield against them with any practical material currently available. When a high-energy heavy ion strikes a metal shield like an aluminum spacecraft hull, it does not simply stop. Instead, it undergoes a process called nuclear fragmentation. The original particle breaks apart, and so does the aluminum nucleus it hits, creating a shower of secondary particles, neutrons, protons, lighter nuclei, and gamma rays that spray in all directions. Some of these secondary particles are actually more biologically damaging than the original cosmic ray. This means that in certain scenarios, adding more traditional shielding can paradoxically increase the radiation dose to the crew inside the spacecraft. This is not a theoretical problem. This is a measured, experimentally verified phenomenon. It is one of the reasons why radiation remains the single biggest unsolved challenge for deep space human exploration. The second source of deep space radiation is solar particle events, or SPEs. These are bursts of energetic particles, mainly protons, emitted by the sun during solar flares and coronal mass ejections. Solar flares are sudden, intense brightening events on the sun's surface caused by the release of magnetic energy stored in the sun's atmosphere. Coronal mass ejections are enormous clouds of magnetized plasma ejected from the sun into space. When these events are directed toward a spacecraft in deep space, they can deliver enormous radiation doses in a very short time. The protons from solar particle events have energies ranging from about 10 million electron volts to several billion electron volts. A major solar particle event can deliver a dose exceeding the lethal threshold to an unshielded astronaut in just a few hours. To illustrate how real this danger is, consider the solar particle event of August 1972. This event occurred between the Apollo 16 mission, which ended in April 1972, and the Apollo 17 mission, which launched in December 1972. Had astronauts been on the lunar surface or in transit during this event, they could have received a dose exceeding 3,800 millisieverts. For context, a whole-body dose of 5,000 millisieverts delivered over a short period is generally considered lethal to 50% of exposed individuals without medical treatment. The August 1972 event could have made Apollo astronauts critically ill or killed them, and they would have had no way to shield themselves. They missed it by a matter of months. Pure luck. Now, let us talk about the numbers, because the numbers tell a story that words alone cannot convey. The average annual radiation dose for a person living on Earth's surface is approximately 2.4 millisieverts. This comes from natural background radiation, cosmic rays that make it through the atmosphere, radon gas from the ground, and naturally occurring radioactive elements in food and water. A single chest X-ray delivers about 0.1 millisieverts. A head CT scan delivers about 1.9 millisieverts. A 6-month mission on the International Space Station, which is still inside Earth's magnetosphere, exposes an astronaut to between 50 and 100 millisieverts. That is equivalent to roughly 25 to 50 years of natural background radiation on Earth, compressed into 6 months. But the ISS has the magnetosphere's partial protection. A round-trip mission to Mars, estimated to take approximately 2.5 to 3 years, would expose the crew to between 870 and 1200 millisieverts. That is equivalent to roughly 630 head CT scans, or 12,000 chest X-rays, delivered continuously over the course of the mission. NASA's current career exposure limit for astronauts, updated in 2022, is 600 millisieverts over an entire career. A single Mars mission would exceed this limit before the crew even arrives at the planet. Let us now turn our attention to the very first thing that would kill you if your spacecraft failed in deep space: the vacuum itself. On Earth, you live at the bottom of an ocean of air. The weight of the atmosphere above you presses down on your body at a pressure of roughly 101.3 kilopascals, or 14.7 pounds per square inch. You do not feel this pressure because your body has evolved to function in perfect equilibrium with it. The air pressure outside your body matches the pressure inside your body, inside your lungs, inside your blood vessels, inside your cells. In space, this external pressure drops to essentially zero, and the consequences are immediate and catastrophic. There is a boundary in physics known as the Armstrong limit, named after United States Air Force surgeon Harry Armstrong. At an altitude of roughly 19 kilometers, about 63,000 feet, the atmospheric pressure drops to approximately 6.3 kilopascals. At this pressure, something extraordinary and terrifying happens. The boiling point of water drops to 37 degrees Celsius, which happens to be the normal temperature of the human body. This means that at or above the Armstrong limit, the water in your tissues begins to vaporize, not because it has been heated to boiling, but because the pressure around it has dropped below the threshold needed to keep it liquid at body temperature. This process is called ebullition. In the vacuum of space, where pressure is effectively zero, ebullition would begin immediately upon exposure. If you were suddenly exposed to the vacuum of space, this is what would actually happen, based on animal experiments and the few accidental human exposures that have been documented. In the first 0 to 2 seconds, the air in your lungs would rush outward through your mouth and nose. This is critical because if you instinctively tried to hold your breath, the expanding air inside your lungs would rupture the lung tissue, causing a pneumothorax. You must exhale. Within 2 to 5 seconds, the water on the surface of your skin, in your mouth, in your eyes, and on all mucous membranes would begin to evaporate rapidly, causing intense cooling of these surfaces. Your body would begin to swell as water vapor forms in soft tissues beneath the skin. The swelling would be dramatic. Your body would expand to roughly twice its normal size, but your skin is elastic enough that it would not burst. That is a Hollywood myth. The skin acts as a pressure container, preventing explosive decompression. Between 8 and 15 seconds after exposure, you would lose consciousness. This is because the oxygen in the blood reaching your brain is rapidly depleted. With no external oxygen pressure to drive gas exchange in the lungs, the oxygen in your blood actually begins to diffuse out of the blood and into the lungs, reversing the normal process. Your brain, the most oxygen-hungry organ in your body, consuming roughly 20% of your total oxygen, despite being only about 2% of your body mass, would run out of oxygenated blood within seconds. Consciousness fades. Between 60 and 90 seconds, if you have not been repressurized and given oxygen, death would occur from a combination of asphyxiation, cardiovascular collapse, and the formation of gas bubbles in the blood, a condition called gas embolism. Beyond 90 seconds, even if you were rescued and repressurized, survival becomes extremely unlikely. This is not theoretical. In 1966, a NASA technician named Jim LeBlanc was testing a spacesuit in a vacuum chamber at the Johnson Space Center when the suit experienced a catastrophic pressure loss. The chamber was at near vacuum conditions. LeBlanc lost consciousness in approximately 12 to 15 seconds. He later reported that the last thing he remembered before blacking out was the sensation of the saliva on his tongue beginning to boil. The chamber was repressurized within roughly 25 to 30 seconds, and LeBlanc survived with no permanent injury. His experience remains one of the very few documented cases of a human surviving near vacuum exposure, and it confirmed what the physics predicted. Consciousness is lost within seconds, and the sensation of your own bodily fluids beginning to vaporize is the last thing you experience. Even when spacecraft and spacesuits function perfectly, the pressure differences between a spacecraft cabin and the vacuum of space create ongoing risks. Every time an astronaut goes on a spacewalk, a procedure known as an extravehicular activity, or EVA, they must transition from the cabin pressure of the spacecraft to the much lower pressure inside their spacesuit. The NASA Extravehicular Mobility Unit, the standard spacesuit used for ISS spacewalks, operates at a pressure of only 222 millimeters of mercury, which is about 29.6 kilopascals, roughly 1/3 of normal sea-level atmospheric pressure. This low pressure is necessary to keep the suit flexible enough for the astronaut to bend their arms and legs and grip tools. But transitioning from cabin pressure to suit pressure creates a risk of decompression sickness, the same condition that affects scuba divers who ascend too quickly. In the human body, nitrogen gas is dissolved in the blood and tissues at a concentration proportional to the surrounding pressure. This is Henry's law, as it does when an astronaut transitions from cabin pressure to suit pressure. The dissolved nitrogen can come out of solution and form bubbles, just as carbon dioxide bubbles form when you open a bottle of carbonated water. These nitrogen bubbles can block small blood vessels, compress nerves, and cause inflammation. The symptoms range from joint pain, colloquially known among divers as the bends, to neurological symptoms like dizziness, confusion, and paralysis. 2, in the most severe cases, cardiovascular collapse and death. To prevent this, astronauts undergo a protocol called pre-breathing, in which they breathe pure oxygen for an extended period. Before an EVA, the oxygen gradually replaces the nitrogen in their blood and tissues, reducing the risk of bubble formation when the pressure drops. On the ISS, the standard protocol involves the camp-out procedure, where 2 astronauts spend the night in the airlock at a reduced pressure of 70.3 kilopascals, while gradually breathing down their nitrogen levels. This entire process takes hours, and it must be done every single time anyone leaves the spacecraft. But here is the critical difference between the ISS and a deep space mission. On the ISS, if a suit develops a problem, if a micrometeoroid punctures the outer layers, if a seal fails, the astronaut is minutes away from the airlock. In deep space, during an EVA on the Martian surface, or on a transit vehicle, the safety margins are thinner, the rescue options fewer, and the consequences of failure more absolute. A suit failure in deep space is not an emergency that ends with a rapid return to Earth. It is an emergency that must be resolved entirely by the crew on hand, with whatever tools and expertise they have, millions of kilometers from any help. Now we come to the subject that NASA itself considers the single greatest unsolved threat to deep space human exploration: radiation. We have already discussed what galactic cosmic rays and solar particle events are, and where they come from. Now, let us go deep into what they actually do to the human body, system by system, organ by organ, cell by cell, because this is where the real horror of deep space becomes clear. At the most fundamental level, ionizing radiation damages the human body by stripping electrons from atoms. Your body is made of atoms, organized into molecules, organized into cells. When a high-energy particle or photon passes through your tissue, it knocks electrons off the atoms in its path, creating charged particles called ions. This is why it is called ionizing radiation. The most common target is water, because water makes up roughly 60% of the human body by mass. When radiation ionizes a water molecule, it creates what are known as free radicals, highly reactive molecular fragments that immediately attack nearby biological structures. The most important free radical produced is the hydroxyl radical, Ohio, which is one of the most chemically aggressive molecules that can exist in biological systems. These free radicals attack DNA, proteins, lipids, and cell membranes with indiscriminate chemical violence. But the most consequential target, the one that matters most for long-term health, is DNA. Your DNA is the instruction manual for building and maintaining every cell in your body. It is a double-stranded helix, 2 complementary strands wound around each other, containing roughly 3.2 billion base pairs in each human cell. Radiation can damage DNA in several ways. It can break a single strand of the double helix, which is called a single-strand break. The cell can usually repair single-strand breaks relatively efficiently, using the intact complementary strand as a template. Radiation can also cause double-strand breaks, where both strands of the helix are severed at or near the same location. Double-strand breaks are far more dangerous because the cell has lost its template for repair. The cell will attempt to repair the break, but the repair is often imperfect. The ends of the broken strands may be rejoined incorrectly, sequences may be deleted, or the wrong sections may be fused together. These imperfect repairs are mutations, permanent changes to the genetic code. A single mutation in the wrong gene, a tumor suppressor gene, or an oncogene can be the first step in the development of cancer. Now, what makes galactic cosmic rays particularly terrifying is the nature of the damage they cause. On Earth, the most common types of ionizing radiation we encounter are X-rays and gamma rays, which are forms of electromagnetic radiation, essentially high-energy photons. These create a relatively sparse pattern of ionization in tissue, what physicists call low linear energy transfer, or low ETI radiation. The damage is spread out, and the body's repair systems can often handle it. Galactic cosmic rays are different. The heavy ions in GCR, the HDZ particles like iron nuclei, traveling at nearly the speed of light, create an incredibly dense column of ionization as they pass through tissue. This is called high linear energy transfer, or high-LET radiation. Imagine the difference between spraying a wall with a garden hose, where the water droplets are spread out, versus cutting through that same wall with a high-pressure water jet, where all the energy is concentrated in a narrow beam. That is the difference between a diagnostic X-ray and an iron nucleus in a galactic cosmic ray. The high-LET particle creates a track of devastation through tissue that is so concentrated, so intense, that the cellular repair machinery cannot cope. Clusters of double-strand breaks, complex DNA damage involving multiple lesions in close proximity, overwhelm the repair systems. The result is either cell death or worse, misrepair and mutation. And in 2017, a study from the University of Nevada, Las Vegas, revealed something that made the situation even worse than previously thought. The researchers discovered what they called the non-targeted effect, or bystander effect, of cosmic radiation. When a galactic cosmic ray damages a cell, the damaged cell sends chemical signals to neighboring cells that were not directly hit. These signals cause the neighboring cells to also exhibit DNA damage, mutations, and chromosomal aberrations. The bystander effect means that the zone of damage from a single cosmic ray track extends far beyond the cells that were physically traversed by the particle. The UNLV study concluded that the actual cancer risk from galactic cosmic rays could be roughly double what had been estimated by previous models, that only accounted for directly hit cells. Double. The cancer risk, that was already considered the number one health concern for deep space missions, may be twice as bad as we thought. The types of cancers most strongly associated with space radiation exposure include leukemia, lung cancer, breast cancer, thyroid cancer, and colorectal cancer. Animal studies provide the most detailed evidence, since no human has yet spent long enough in deep space to develop these cancers as a directly measurable outcome. In mouse models, exposure to iron-56 heavy ions, one of the HGE components of galactic cosmic rays, has been shown to produce lung cancers, including both squamous cell carcinoma and adenocarcinoma. Exposure to silicon-28 ions and high-energy protons also produced adenocarcinoma. These are not mild, easily treated cancers. These are aggressive malignancies that, in humans, often require surgery, chemotherapy, and radiation therapy, none of which would be available on a deep space mission. Perhaps even more disturbing are the epigenetic effects. Epigenetics refers to modifications to DNA that do not change the actual genetic sequence, but change how genes are expressed, whether they are turned on or turned off. Research has shown that HGE particles cause changes in DNA methylation patterns in human bronchial epithelial cells, the cells lining the airways. These radiation-induced methylation changes occur early after exposure and persist over time, indicating that they are heritable, meaning they are passed on when the cell divides. Similar epigenetic changes have been found in the hippocampal cells of mice exposed to space radiation. The implications are profound. Space radiation may not only increase the risk of cancer in the exposed astronaut, but could potentially alter the epigenetic landscape in ways that affect gene expression for years or even decades, and in ways that could theoretically be passed to future generations if reproductive cells are affected. Now, let us talk about what space radiation does to the brain. This is one of the most actively researched areas in space medicine, because the consequences for a crew on a multi-year deep space mission are so severe. Galactic cosmic rays penetrate the hull of any spacecraft we can currently build. They penetrate the skull, they enter the brain, and the brain is extraordinarily vulnerable to this type of damage. The brain is the most metabolically active organ in the body, consuming roughly 20% of the body's total energy. It relies on a dense network of blood vessels, a complex architecture of neurons and supporting glial cells, and a constant process of neuronesis, the birth of new neurons, particularly in a region called the hippocampus, which is critical for learning and memory. Animal studies, primarily in mice and rats exposed to HCE particles at doses comparable to those expected on a Mars mission, have shown a constellation of alarming effects. Neurogenesis in the hippocampus is significantly reduced. The birth of new neurons slows dramatically. The existing neurons show reduced dendritic complexity, meaning their branching extensions, which are the structures that form connections with other neurons, become simpler, shorter, and less numerous. The density of dendritic spines, the tiny protrusions on dendrites where synapses form, decreases markedly. Fewer spines mean fewer synaptic connections, which means less efficient communication between neurons. This is not subtle. Studies have shown marked and persistent reduction in dendritic complexity and spine density in exposed animals, effects that did not resolve over the observation period. The brain's own immune cells, called microglia, appear to be a major mediator of this damage. Normally, microglia play a beneficial role, clearing cellular debris and maintaining the health of neural circuits. They also participate in a process called synaptic pruning, selectively removing unnecessary or weak synaptic connections to refine neural circuits. But exposure to space radiation appears to push microglia into an overactive state, where they begin pruning synapses indiscriminately, removing connections that should be kept. This microglia-mediated overpruning is believed to be a major mechanism behind the cognitive deficits observed in irradiated animals. The cognitive effects documented in these studies are directly relevant to a crew on a deep space mission. Animals exposed to doses equivalent to a Mars mission show impaired memory, both short-term and long-term. They show reduced executive function, the ability to plan, make decisions, and adapt to changing situations. Processing speed decreases. Some studies have shown effects on the animal's ability to recognize novelty and to distinguish between similar but different environments, skills that rely heavily on intact hippocampal function. Informally, space scientists have begun using the term space brain to describe the cognitive fog that astronauts report after extended spaceflight, though it is important to note that current ISS astronauts are exposed to far lower radiation doses than a deep space crew would face. Beyond cognitive effects, space radiation physically damages the blood vessels in the brain. HGAZ particles can cause capillary hemorrhages and disrupt the blood-brain barrier, the tightly sealed boundary between the bloodstream and the brain tissue that carefully controls which substances can enter the brain. The smaller cerebral blood vessels are more susceptible to radiation damage. Studies show thickening of vessel walls, narrowing of the vessel lumen, and an increased risk of microaneurysms. The long-term implications include an elevated risk of hemorrhagic stroke and cerebral small vessel disease. For an astronaut on a multi-year deep space mission, a stroke is not just a medical emergency. It is a medical emergency that cannot be treated. There is no neurosurgeon, there is no CT scanner, there is no emergency room. There is only the crew, a first aid kit, and a communication delay measured in minutes or hours. The cardiovascular system tells an equally alarming story, and here we have the closest thing to direct human evidence. In 2016, a study published in the journal Scientific Reports examined the long-term health outcomes of the Apollo astronauts, the only humans who have ever traveled beyond low Earth orbit. The study found that the Apollo lunar astronauts, the ones who actually went to the moon and beyond the magnetosphere, had cardiovascular disease mortality rates that were approximately 4 to 5 times higher than astronauts who had only flown in low Earth orbit, and astronauts who had never flown at all. 4 to 5 times. This is a staggering difference. The study was limited by a small sample size. Only 24 humans have ever traveled beyond low Earth orbit, all of them Apollo astronauts, but the statistical difference was dramatic and consistent. To investigate whether the cardiovascular findings could be attributed to deep space radiation specifically, the researchers conducted parallel experiments with mice. They exposed mice to the types of radiation found in deep space, including simulated galactic cosmic rays, and examined their vascular systems. The irradiated mice showed significant damage to the lining of their blood vessels, consistent with the early stages of atherosclerosis, the hardening and narrowing of arteries that is the underlying cause of most heart attacks and strokes. This was the same type of vascular damage seen at much higher rates in the Apollo lunar astronauts compared to their low Earth orbit counterparts. The mechanism is well understood. Ionizing radiation damages the endothelial cells that line the inside of every blood vessel in the body. These cells form a single-cell thick layer that is critical for maintaining vascular health. They regulate blood clotting, control the passage of molecules between the blood and surrounding tissue, and produce signaling molecules that keep the vessel wall relaxed and smooth. When radiation damages these cells, it triggers an inflammatory response. White blood cells accumulate in the vessel wall. The smooth muscle cells in the vessel wall begin to proliferate abnormally. Fatty deposits accumulate. The vessel gradually stiffens and narrows. This is atherosclerosis, and it is the single biggest killer of humans on Earth. Space radiation appears to dramatically accelerate this process. Space radiation also damages the heart muscle directly. In deep space, the combined effects of radiation and microgravity create a double assault on the cardiovascular system that is worse than either factor alone. Radiation damages the structural proteins and the DNA of cardiac muscle cells, while microgravity causes the heart to atrophy due to reduced workload. The combination leads to a heart that is both structurally weakened by atrophy and cellularly damaged by radiation, a combination that significantly increases the risk of arrhythmias, heart failure, and sudden cardiac death. There is another way cosmic rays interact with the human body that the Apollo astronauts experienced firsthand and reported in their debriefings: the phenomenon of cosmic ray light flashes. Multiple Apollo astronauts, including Buzz Aldrin and Gene Cernan, reported seeing mysterious flashes and streaks of light even when their eyes were closed, particularly in the darkened cabin during rest periods. These flashes were caused by individual galactic cosmic ray particles passing through the eyeball and interacting with the retina. When a high-energy charged particle traverses the retina, it directly stimulates the photoreceptor cells, the rods and cones, producing a perceived flash of light. Some astronauts described them as bright white flashes, others as streaks or shooting stars moving across their visual field. The phenomenon was consistent and reproducible, more pronounced during dark adapted periods when the astronauts were trying to sleep. While the flashes themselves are harmless in the short term, they are a visible, tangible reminder that cosmic ray particles are constantly passing through your body in deep space, through your eyes, through your brain, through every organ, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, for the entire duration of the mission. And while each flash represents just one particle interacting with the retina, countless other particles are simultaneously passing through the rest of the body without any visible signal. Long-term radiation exposure also significantly increases the risk of cataracts, the clouding of the lens of the eye that impairs vision. Studies of astronaut populations have shown that those with higher cumulative mission doses develop cataracts earlier than those with lower doses. Both cortical cataracts and posterior subcapsular cataracts have been associated with space radiation exposure. On a multi-year deep space mission, progressive cataract development could impair the crew's ability to perform critical visual tasks, reading instruments, conducting repairs, navigating the surface of Mars, with no possibility of surgical correction until return to Earth. The immune system, your body's defense against infection and cancer, is perhaps the most consequentially affected system when you consider the compound risks of deep space. Space radiation, microgravity, stress, sleep deprivation, and altered nutrition all independently suppress immune function. Combined, their effects are synergistic, meaning the total suppression is greater than the sum of the individual effects. Research on ISS astronauts has documented significant changes in immune function during and after spaceflight. T cells, the white blood cells that orchestrate the adaptive immune response and directly kill infected or cancerous cells, show reduced function. Natural killer cells, which are critical for detecting and destroying cancer cells and virus-infected cells without prior sensitization, also show diminished activity. One of the most striking findings in space immunology is the reactivation of latent viruses. Many humans carry dormant viruses in their bodies, viruses that were acquired during childhood or earlier in life, and that the immune system has suppressed, but not eliminated. On the ISS, astronauts have been found to shed reactivated herpes simplex virus, varicella zoster virus, which is the virus that causes chickenpox and shingles, Epstein-Barr virus, and cytomegalovirus, at significantly higher rates than matched controls on Earth. This means that the immune suppression caused by spaceflight is severe enough to allow viruses that have been dormant for years or decades to reactivate and begin replicating again. On Earth, this is manageable. Antiviral medications are available. Medical care is accessible. In deep space, a reactivated virus in an immunocompromised astronaut could lead to a serious, potentially life-threatening infection with limited treatment options. But here is the truly chilling implication when you combine immune suppression with increased cancer risk. Space radiation is constantly generating DNA mutations that could initiate cancerous changes in cells throughout the body. At the same time, the immune system, which normally surveils the body for abnormal cells, and destroys them before they can develop into tumors, is suppressed. More cancer cells are being created while fewer cancer cells are being detected and eliminated. This is what scientists call a double hit: increased oncogenesis combined with decreased immunosurveillance. The net result is a dramatically elevated cancer risk that is likely even higher than radiation exposure alone would predict. Given the magnitude of the radiation threat, you might naturally ask, why can we not just build thicker walls? Why not surround the crew with meters of lead or steel or some other dense material? This is a reasonable question, and the answer reveals one of the most frustrating aspects of deep space radiation protection. As I mentioned earlier, traditional metal shielding, like the aluminum alloys used in spacecraft construction, provides limited protection against galactic cosmic rays and can actually make things worse through nuclear fragmentation. When a high-energy heavy ion hits an aluminum nucleus, both nuclei shatter, producing a spray of secondary particles including neutrons, which are particularly biologically damaging because they are electrically neutral and therefore not deflected by electromagnetic forces, and can penetrate deep into tissue. Water is a better shielding material per unit mass than aluminum, because the hydrogen atoms in water are more effective at slowing down and absorbing neutrons and secondary particles. But the amount of water needed to significantly reduce GCR dose is enormous. You would need a layer several meters thick surrounding the entire crew compartment, which translates to hundreds of tons of additional mass. Every kilogram of mass on a spacecraft has to be launched from Earth's surface at enormous cost, and the propulsion requirements scale directly with mass. The shielding required to make a meaningful difference against GCR is simply impractical with current launch capabilities. Polyethylene, the common plastic used in milk jugs and plastic bags, has been tested by NASA as a shielding material and performs better than aluminum on a per-mass basis. High-density polyethylene tiles have been installed in the sleeping quarters of the ISS as supplementary shielding. But even polyethylene cannot stop the highest energy GCR particles. Hydrogenated boron nitride nanotubes, or BNNTs, are a more advanced material currently being tested by NASA. They contain hydrogen, boron, and nitrogen atoms, all of which have favorable nuclear properties for radiation absorption. BNNTs also have excellent structural properties, meaning they could potentially serve as both structural material and radiation shielding, reducing the mass penalty. But this technology is still in early development and has not been proven at the scale needed for a crewed deep space vehicle. The idea of creating an artificial magnetosphere around a spacecraft, essentially replicating Earth's magnetic field on a smaller scale, has been proposed and studied. A powerful magnetic field generated by superconducting magnets could theoretically deflect charged particles away from the crew compartment. But the engineering challenges are formidable. The magnets would need to be superconducting, requiring cryogenic cooling systems. The magnetic field would need to be enormous, extending many meters beyond the spacecraft to be effective against the highest energy particles. The mass and power requirements are currently beyond practical engineering capability. Some researchers have proposed using plasma-based magnetohydrodynamic shields, where a magnetic field is used to hold a cloud of plasma around the spacecraft that absorbs incoming radiation, but this concept remains highly theoretical. Pharmaceutical countermeasures, drugs that could protect cells from radiation damage or enhance DNA repair, are another area of active research. Hemifostine, a drug currently used in radiation therapy on Earth to protect healthy tissues from radiation damage, is being evaluated for potential space applications. Various antioxidant compounds that could neutralize free radicals have been studied, but none of these approaches have been proven effective for the chronic, mixed-field radiation environment of deep space, where astronauts would be exposed continuously for years to a complex spectrum of particle types and energies. The honest scientific assessment, as stated by multiple NASA researchers and advisory panels, is that radiation remains a showstopper for long-duration deep space missions, and no currently proven practical solution exists. Now, let us turn to the second major threat, the one that attacks your body even without radiation, even without vacuum exposure, the simple absence of gravity. Microgravity, the condition of apparent weightlessness experienced in orbit or during deep space transit, triggers a cascade of physiological changes that begins within hours and accelerates over months and years. Every major organ system is affected, and many of the changes are only partially reversible upon return to gravity. The human skeleton is a dynamic, living tissue, not the inert structural framework most people imagine. Bone is constantly being remodeled, a process in which specialized cells called osteoclasts break down old or damaged bone tissue, and other cells called osteoblasts lay down new bone. On Earth, this process is in balance, tuned by millions of years of evolution to maintain bones strong enough to support the body against the constant pull of gravity. The mechanical stress of gravity, the force of your body weight transmitted through your skeleton every time you stand, walk, run, or jump, is a critical signal that stimulates osteoblast activity. It tells your bones that they need to be strong. In microgravity, this signal vanishes. The mechanical loading on weight-bearing bones, the hips, the spine, the legs, drops to near zero. Osteoclasts continue to break down bone at their normal rate, but osteoblasts, deprived of their mechanical stimulus, dramatically slow their activity. The result is a net loss of bone mineral density. NASA data shows that astronauts lose between 1 and 1.5% of their bone mineral density per month in weight-bearing bones during spaceflight. To put this in perspective, an elderly person with osteoporosis on Earth loses roughly 1 to 2% of bone density per year. Astronauts in space lose that same amount every single month. A 6-month ISS mission can result in a 6 to 9% loss of bone density, equivalent to the bone loss an elderly person might experience over a decade. But a Mars mission is not 6 months. The total microgravity exposure during transit alone would be 12 to 18 months, plus any additional time on the Martian surface at only 38% of Earth's gravity, which is better than zero but insufficient to prevent bone loss entirely. Over the course of a 2.5 to 3 year mission, an astronaut could potentially lose 30 to 45% of their bone mineral density in weight-bearing bones. At those levels, the risk of fracture becomes extreme. A simple stumble upon return to Earth, or even during surface operations on Mars, could result in a broken hip, a shattered vertebra, or a fractured leg. And the calcium that leaves the bones does not simply vanish. It enters the bloodstream, creating a condition called hypercalcemia, and is eventually filtered by the kidneys. The excess calcium in the urine dramatically increases the risk of kidney stones, which are already one of the most painful medical conditions known. Multiple astronauts have developed kidney stones during or shortly after spaceflight. On the ISS, an astronaut with a kidney stone can be evacuated to Earth within hours. On a Mars mission, a blocking kidney stone could lead to hydronephrosis, infection, and potentially fatal renal failure, with no urologist available and no operating room in existence for the next several million kilometers. A landmark 2020 study published in Nature examined bone recovery in astronauts after their return to Earth from ISS missions. The findings were sobering. Even 12 months after landing, astronauts had not fully recovered the bone density lost during their time in space. Weight-bearing bones, particularly the tibia and hip, showed the least recovery. Some astronauts showed incomplete recovery even beyond the 12-month mark. The implication for a Mars mission is stark. An astronaut who spends 2.5 to 3 years in reduced gravity may return to Earth with irreversibly weakened bones, permanent structural damage to their skeleton that no amount of rehabilitation can fully reverse. The muscles face a similar assault. Without gravity, the muscles that normally work against gravity every moment of every day, the postural muscles, the calf muscles, the muscles of the thighs and back, begin to atrophy rapidly. The soleus muscle in the calf, one of the most important anti-gravity muscles, can lose up to 20% of its mass in just 11 days of spaceflight. 11 days. The rate of muscle atrophy varies by muscle group, with the weight-bearing muscles of the lower body affected most severely. But even the upper body musculature and the deep core muscles that stabilize the spine show significant loss over time. Astronauts on the ISS spend approximately 2 to 2.5 hours every single day exercising on specialized equipment designed to mitigate this loss. The Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, or RED, provides resistance training that simulates weightlifting and gravity. The T2 treadmill, modified with bungee harnesses that pull the astronaut toward the treadmill surface to simulate body weight, provides running exercise. The CVIS cycle ergometer provides cardiovascular conditioning. Despite this rigorous daily exercise regimen, astronauts still lose muscle mass and function. Studies have documented roughly a 10% reduction in maximal voluntary contraction force, even with the ISS exercise countermeasures in place. The exercise regimen slows the loss but does not prevent it. On a deep space mission, every piece of exercise equipment adds mass, volume, power consumption, and complexity to the spacecraft. The exercise equipment on the ISS weighs hundreds of kilograms and takes up significant habitable volume. For a Mars transit vehicle with strict mass and volume constraints, maintaining an ISS-level exercise capability would be a significant engineering challenge. And even if it could be maintained, the current evidence suggests it would not be sufficient to prevent the deconditioning that would accumulate over a 2.5 to 3 year mission. Researchers have estimated that a Mars trip could result in approximately 15% loss of lean body mass, even with a full exercise program, reducing the astronaut's physical capacity to a level comparable to a sedentary elderly person on Earth. Upon arrival at Mars, where they would need to be at peak physical condition to perform demanding surface operations, they would instead be at their weakest. In microgravity, without the compressive force of gravity on the spine, the intervertebral discs absorb fluid and expand. The result is that astronauts grow taller, typically by 3 to 5 centimeters during spaceflight. This might sound like a minor curiosity, or even a benefit, but the consequences are significant and painful. The expansion stretches the spinal ligaments, the joint capsules, and the nerve roots along the spine. The paraspinal muscles, the deep muscles that run along the vertebral column and stabilize it, decrease in cross-sectional area because they no longer have to resist gravity's compressive load on the spine. The lumbar curve, the natural inward curve of the lower back, flattens, reducing the range of motion. After returning to Earth, astronauts have a significantly elevated risk of herniated intervertebral discs, approximately 4 times the risk of the general population in the first year after return. The expanded discs, weakened spinal muscles, and stretched ligaments create a spine that is structurally less stable and more vulnerable to injury under the renewed load of Earth's gravity. Astronaut medical records document a notable incidence of back pain and spinal problems in the post-flight period. The heart is a muscle, and like all muscles in the absence of gravitational loading, it atrophies in space. On Earth, the heart must work against gravity to pump blood upward from the lower body to the brain. In microgravity, this gravitational gradient disappears. The heart no longer needs to pump against gravity, and without this stimulus, it begins to lose mass. Research from astronaut Scott Kelly during his 340-day ISS mission showed that his heart lost an average of 0.74 grams of mass per week, and this was despite a rigorous daily exercise program. Over the course of his nearly 1-year mission, the total cardiac mass loss was significant. Long-duration spaceflight causes cardiac remodeling, structural changes to the heart muscle itself. The heart chambers may change shape and size, the heart's electrical conduction system may be altered, and the heart muscle fibers may reorganize. Animal studies have shown that microgravity induces changes in the expression of genes related to heart muscle structure, including sarcomeric genes and extracellular matrix genes. These changes are associated with arrhythmias, various types of abnormal heart rhythms, and have been linked to conditions like long QT syndrome, which increases the risk of sudden cardiac arrest. Left ventricular mass decreases by roughly 9.1% during short-term missions. The combination of a smaller, weaker heart and stiffer blood vessels creates a cardiovascular system that is profoundly decompensated when the astronaut returns to a gravitational environment. One of the most dramatic visible effects of microgravity is the cephalic fluid shift. On Earth, gravity constantly pulls about 70% of the body's fluid volume toward the lower body. In microgravity, with gravity no longer pulling fluid downward, approximately 1 to 2 liters of fluid shifts from the legs to the upper body and head. This is visible from the first hours of spaceflight. The face swells, becoming puffy and congested. The veins in the neck become distended. The eyes may appear slightly bulging. The legs become thinner, losing their normal fullness. Astronauts have described the sensation as feeling like they have a permanent head cold, with nasal congestion that never clears. This headward fluid shift is not just cosmetically striking, it is the root cause of one of the most concerning medical conditions in spaceflight, a condition so significant that NASA considers it the #1 spaceflight-related health risk. It is called Spaceflight Associated Neuro-Ocular Syndrome, or SANS. SANS was first formally identified in 2005, originally under the name Visual Impairment Intracranial Pressure Syndrome, and has been a major focus of space medicine research ever since. Approximately 2/3 of ISS crew members are affected to some degree. The headward fluid shift causes an increase in intracranial pressure, the pressure of the cerebrospinal fluid surrounding the brain, and an increase in intraocular pressure, the pressure of the fluid inside the eye. The elevated cerebrospinal fluid pressure in the space surrounding the optic nerve causes swelling of the optic disc, a condition called papilledema, where the optic disc bulges forward at the point where the optic nerve enters the eye. The elevated pressure also physically flattens the back of the eyeball, a process called globe flattening. The choroid layer of the eye, the blood vessel-rich layer beneath the retina, thickens and develops folds. The retina itself develops folds, small areas of ischemic damage, essentially tiny retinal strokes, have been documented. The axial length of the eye decreases, and the anterior chamber depth changes, collectively shifting the eye's focal properties and causing farsightedness. The clinical symptoms experienced by affected astronauts include blurred close-up vision, with some astronauts requiring reading glasses for the first time in their lives after spaceflight. Visual scotomas, areas of reduced or missing vision, have been reported. Headaches are common. But unlike idiopathic intracranial hypertension, a similar condition on Earth, astronauts with SANS do not typically report pulsatile tinnitus or diplopia. The changes affect both eyes and occur in both male and female astronauts. Some of the changes, such as choroidal thickening, appear to be at least partially reversible after return to Earth. Others, such as certain retinal changes, may be permanent. On a 2.5 to 3 year Mars mission, with no access to ophthalmological care, no ability to measure intraocular pressure with any precision, and no treatment options beyond the medications brought aboard, the progressive deterioration of visual function could compromise the crew's ability to perform mission-critical tasks. Operating complex equipment, reading instruments, navigating terrain, conducting scientific observations, all require intact visual function, and the condition would likely worsen as the mission progressed, with no intervention possible. The brain itself undergoes structural changes in microgravity that have been documented through MRI scans of astronauts taken before and after spaceflight. A 2017 study published in the New England Journal of Medicine examined MRI data from astronauts after both short-duration and long-duration missions. The researchers found narrowing of the central sulcus, one of the major grooves at the top of the brain in the majority of long-duration astronauts. They found upward displacement of the brain within the skull, as if the brain were floating higher in the cranial cavity. They found narrowing of the cerebrospinal fluid spaces at the vertex, the top of the skull. A 2019 study published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences found significant enlargement of the lateral and third ventricles, the fluid-filled cavities deep within the brain, after long-duration spaceflight. The ventricles expanded as cerebrospinal fluid accumulated. Perhaps most concerning, a 2023 study published in Nature reported that ventricular enlargement persists for at least 6 to 12 months after return to Earth, showing only partial recovery. The researchers found that astronauts need at least 3 years between missions for their ventricles to fully return to baseline. If an astronaut undertook a Mars mission without adequate recovery time from a previous mission, the cumulative brain changes could be compounding. Additional findings include grey matter volume changes associated with decreased cognitive performance, thinning of the cerebral cortex in the right occipital lobe, reduction in the size of the left thalamus, and deformation of the pituitary gland, the master hormonal control center of the body. These are not hypothetical projections. These are measured structural changes in the brains of real astronauts who spent 6 to 12 months on the International Space Station, a facility that is still within Earth's magnetic protection, still at zero, rather than the partial gravity of a Mars surface stay, and with mission durations less than half of what a Mars mission would require. The brain changes observed after 12 months on the ISS should be considered a minimum baseline for what a Mars mission crew would experience, compounded by the additional neurological damage from galactic cosmic ray exposure that is largely absent on the ISS. Now, I want you to pause and absorb what we have covered so far, because we have examined the vacuum, The radiation environment, including its effects on DNA, the brain, the cardiovascular system, the eyes, and the immune system. And we have gone through the musculoskeletal degradation, the fluid shift, the ocular changes, and the brain's structural changes caused by microgravity. And we are not finished. Deep space has more ways to compromise the human body, ways that do not involve radiation or microgravity at all. If you're still here, if this information is resonating with you, take a moment to drop a comment about which finding has been the most surprising or most unsettling. And if you have not subscribed yet, now is the moment, because the depth of research we are bringing to this video is rare on this platform, and subscribing ensures you never miss another deep dive like this. Let us now turn to something that gets far less attention than radiation or microgravity, but is equally critical for crew survival on a long-duration deep space mission: the psychological dimension. NASA formally categorizes isolation and confinement as the third of its big 5 hazards of human spaceflight, alongside radiation, microgravity, distance from Earth, and hostile closed environments. But the psychological challenges of deep space are qualitatively different from anything that has been experienced in space to date. And the difference is not a matter of degree, it is a difference in kind. Consider the psychological anchors that sustain astronauts on the International Space Station. Every 90 minutes they orbit the Earth. They can look out the cupola window and see the planet below, the continents, the oceans, the clouds, the lights of cities at night. This view has been described by numerous astronauts as profoundly moving, emotionally sustaining, and psychologically grounding. It is a constant, vivid, tangible reminder that home exists, that it is right there, that the people they love are just a few hundred kilometers away. Communication with the ground is nearly instantaneous, with a delay of only about 1 to 2 seconds. Astronauts can video call their families, speak with their flight surgeons, receive real-time guidance from mission control, and perhaps most importantly, if something goes seriously wrong, an emergency evacuation to Earth via a Soyuz or Crew Dragon spacecraft is possible within hours. On a mission to Mars, every single one of these psychological anchors is stripped away. The Earth, initially a bright blue jewel visible from the spacecraft windows, becomes progressively smaller as the spacecraft travels outward. Within a few weeks, it is a small blue dot. Within a few months, it may be difficult to distinguish from a star with the naked eye. Eventually, it disappears entirely into the backdrop of space. Indistinguishable, invisible, gone. The communication delay increases with distance. At its closest approach, Mars is roughly 55 million kilometers from Earth, resulting in a one-way communication delay of about 3 to 4 minutes. At its farthest, the distance exceeds 400 million kilometers, with a delay of about 22 to 24 minutes. There can be no real-time conversation. You send a message and wait up to 48 minutes for a response. Video calls with family become impossible in any meaningful sense. Guidance from mission control becomes advisory rather than directive, with decisions increasingly falling on the crew alone. An emergency evacuation is not merely difficult, it is impossible. Once the spacecraft leaves Earth orbit on a Mars-bound trajectory, there is no turning back. The laws of orbital mechanics dictate the trajectory. The spacecraft does not have enough fuel to reverse course and return to Earth. The crew is committed to the full mission duration, approximately 2.5 to 3 years from the moment the main engine fires. If someone becomes critically ill, if someone suffers a psychiatric crisis, if an irreconcilable interpersonal conflict threatens crew cohesion, there is no escape. The crew must manage whatever happens with whatever resources they have. We have historical precedents that offer glimpses into what prolonged isolation and confinement do to humans, though none perfectly replicate the conditions of deep space. Soviet and Russian submarine crews on extended deployments have documented cases of paranoia, hallucinations, irritability, depression, and psychotic episodes. Personnel at Antarctic research stations during the 6-month winter over period, when no flights in or out are possible and the station is completely isolated, experience what is known as winter over syndrome, characterized by irritability, depression, hostility, cognitive decline, interpersonal conflicts, and insomnia. The symptoms tend to worsen as the isolation period progresses, peaking in the 3rd quarter of the confinement period. The most ambitious ground-based simulation of a Mars mission was the Mars 500 experiment conducted by the Russian Academy of Sciences and the European Space Agency between 2010 and 2011. 6 male volunteers were confined in a simulated spacecraft habitat for 520 days, roughly the duration of a Mars mission. The experiment was groundbreaking in its duration and provided valuable psychological data. The results were concerning. Significant sleep disruption occurred, with crew members' sleep-wake cycles becoming increasingly desynchronized from each other and from the 24-hour clock. Activity levels decreased markedly over the course of the mission, with one crew member becoming almost completely sedentary by the end. Interpersonal conflicts increased over time, though the crew managed to maintain functional relationships. Cognitive performance showed measurable degradation. Psychological assessments revealed increasing lethargy, reduced motivation, and a phenomenon researchers described as psychological torpor, a kind of emotional and behavioral withdrawal. But the Mars 500 experiment had significant limitations as a psychological analog for an actual Mars mission. The participants knew they were on Earth. They knew that in a genuine emergency, they could break out of the facility and be in a hospital within hours. They experienced Earth's gravity, Earth's atmosphere, and the knowledge that the outside world was just behind a wall. A crew on an actual Mars mission would have none of these psychological safety nets. They would know, with absolute certainty, that they are farther from home than any human has ever been, that rescue is physically impossible, and that their survival depends entirely on each other and on the machinery surrounding them. The psychological weight of that knowledge is something no simulation can replicate. The overview effect, a term coined by author Frank White in 1987, describes the cognitive and emotional shift experienced by astronauts when they see Earth from space. Astronauts have described it as a profound sense of the fragility and interconnectedness of all life, a sudden and overwhelming awareness of the thin blue line of the atmosphere that separates the living world from the void, a feeling of transcendence and unity. It is one of the most consistently positive psychological experiences reported by space travelers and has been suggested as a beneficial factor for astronaut mental health. But in deep space, the overview effect is lost. There is no fragile blue marble outside the window. There is blackness, vast, unchanging, empty blackness. Some psychologists have theorized a phenomenon that might be called the inverse overview effect, or the black void effect, where prolonged exposure to the featureless emptiness of interplanetary space could trigger existential crisis, depersonalization, a sense of cosmic insignificance, and dissociative states. No human has yet experienced this for long enough to study it empirically, but the psychological research on sensory deprivation and environmental monotony strongly suggests it is a real and significant risk. The disruption of circadian rhythms in deep space is another psychological and physiological stressor with far-reaching consequences. The human body runs on an internal clock, the circadian rhythm, which evolved over millions of years to synchronize with the 24-hour cycle of light and darkness on Earth. This clock regulates not just sleep and wakefulness, but hormone release, metabolism, immune function, cognitive performance, mood, and cellular repair processes. On the ISS, astronauts experience 16 orbital sunrises and sunsets per day, each complete orbit taking only 90 minutes. This rapid cycling of light and dark is profoundly disruptive to the circadian system. In deep space, the problem is different, but equally severe. There is no sunrise. There is no sunset. There is only the constant, unchanging darkness of interplanetary space, punctuated by the distant, unvarying light of distant stars and the slowly changing appearance of the sun. ISS data shows that astronauts average only about 6 hours of sleep per night, significantly below the 7 to 8 hours recommended for optimal cognitive and physical function. Sleep quality is poor, with frequent awakenings. Approximately 75% of ISS astronauts use sleep medications at some point during their mission, primarily zolpidem and antihistamines. Circadian misalignment, where the body's internal clock falls out of sync with the desired sleep-wake schedule, leads to impaired cognitive function, increased error rates, mood disturbances, and immune suppression. Research published on ISS crew performance has linked circadian disruption to significant fatigue-induced increases in the risk of operational errors. a terrifying finding when you consider that the crew of a deep space mission is responsible for operating a complex spacecraft with zero margin for critical mistakes. On a Mars transit, the crew would rely on artificial lighting protocols to simulate a day-night cycle, using lights that shift in intensity and wavelength throughout the day to mimic the changing spectrum of sunlight. NASA and other agencies have invested in LED lighting systems for spacecraft that can produce different light temperatures at different times. But the effectiveness of these artificial systems over the course of a 2.5 to 3 year mission has never been tested. The human circadian system evolved to respond to the intense, full-spectrum light of the sun, the gentle transition of dawn and dusk, and the complete darkness of night. Whether an LED panel in a spacecraft cabin can truly substitute for this over years of continuous use is an open question, and the ISS experience suggests that it cannot, at least not with current technology. The behavioral and psychiatric risks of a deep space mission extend beyond sleep disruption and isolation. The documented psychological conditions associated with spaceflight and spaceflight analog environments include clinical depression, generalized anxiety disorder, interpersonal conflicts and crew tension that can escalate to mission-threatening hostility, psychosomatic symptoms where psychological distress manifests as physical illness, and, in the most severe projections, potential psychotic episodes. Historical records from early space missions include incidents where crew psychology became a mission-critical issue. During the Skylab 4 mission in 1973, the 3-person crew, overwhelmed by an excessive workload and insufficient rest, effectively went on strike for a day, refusing to communicate with mission control. It was the first known astronaut revolt, driven by exhaustion, frustration, and the feeling that their human needs were being ignored. On a Mars mission, if a crew member develops a severe depressive episode, there is no psychiatrist to visit. If a crew member develops psychotic symptoms, there is no psychiatric ward. The remaining crew must manage the situation with whatever training they have received and whatever medications are available, all while continuing to operate a complex spacecraft and manage their own psychological health. If a violent interpersonal conflict erupts, there is nowhere to separate the parties. Everyone is confined in a space roughly the size of a small apartment, 24 hours a day, for years. The pharmacological options are limited and further constrained by the fact that medications degrade faster in the space radiation environment, reducing their shelf life and potentially altering their efficacy. Crew selection and psychological screening are recognized as critical components of Mars mission planning. NASA's astronaut selection process already includes extensive psychological evaluation, and researchers have proposed selecting crew members based on biomarkers associated with better stress adaptation, such as genetic profiles associated with resilience and emotional regulation. But no screening process is perfectly predictive, especially for a mission lasting 2.5 to 3 years under conditions that no human has ever experienced. The history of isolated and confined environments on Earth shows that psychological breakdown can occur even in carefully selected, highly trained individuals when the duration and intensity of the confinement exceed expectations. Let us now examine the hostile environment of space itself. Beyond radiation and microgravity, the physical dangers that surround a deep space spacecraft at every moment of the journey. Temperature is one of the most fundamental challenges. Space itself, being a near vacuum, does not have a temperature in the conventional sense, because temperature is a property of matter and space has almost no matter. But objects in space, including spacecraft and astronauts in spacesuits, experience extreme thermal conditions determined by their exposure to the sun and the thermal properties of their surfaces. In direct sunlight at Earth's orbital distance, approximately 1 astronomical unit from the sun, the surface of a spacecraft can reach temperatures of 121 degrees Celsius, 250 degrees Fahrenheit. In shadow, shielded from the sun, that same surface can plummet to minus 157 degrees Celsius, minus 250 degrees Fahrenheit, or even colder. The transition can occur rapidly, for instance, when a rotating spacecraft moves from sunlight to shadow, or when an astronaut on an EVA steps behind a structure that blocks the sun. Spacecraft manage these thermal extremes through a combination of passive and active thermal control systems, multi-layer insulation, the reflective gold and silver blankets visible on almost every spacecraft, reflects solar radiation and insulates against both heat gain and heat loss. Active thermal control systems use fluid loops, circulating a coolant through the spacecraft structure to absorb excess heat and transport it to radiators, large flat panels that radiate the heat away into space as infrared radiation. Heaters are used to keep critical components above their minimum operating temperatures during cold phases. The ISS, for example, uses an ammonia-based external thermal control system with large radiator panels. If these thermal control systems fail during a deep space mission, the consequences are dire and rapid. Without active cooling, the interior of a Summit spacecraft would heat up as solar energy continued to pour in through the hull and windows, while the generated heat from electronics, life support systems, and human metabolism accumulated with no way to be shed. Without heating, a spacecraft in shadow could cool to temperatures that damage electronics, freeze water lines, and ultimately endanger the crew. The human body can survive only within a remarkably narrow core temperature range, roughly 36.1 to 37.8 degrees Celsius. A deviation of just a few degrees in either direction leads to hypothermia or hypothermia, both of which are life-threatening. Interestingly, research has shown that astronauts' core body temperature actually increases by approximately 1 degree Celsius during long-duration spaceflight, believed to be due to reduced convective and evaporative heat loss in microgravity. In the weightless environment, warm air does not rise away from the skin as it does on Earth, and sweat does not drip off but instead forms a film that inhibits evaporative cooling. This elevated baseline temperature means astronauts are already closer to the threshold of heat stress before any external thermal problem occurs. Micrometeoroids represent another constant threat in deep space. These are tiny particles of rock and metal, remnants of comets, asteroids, and the general debris of the solar system, ranging in size from microscopic dust grains to particles a few millimeters across. What makes them dangerous is not their size but their velocity. Micrometeoroids travel at speeds of 10 to 70 kilometers per second, which is 22,000 to 156,000 miles per hour. At these velocities, the kinetic energy of even a tiny particle is enormous. A paint fleck traveling at orbital velocity carries enough energy to crack spacecraft windows. A particle the size of a grain of sand can penetrate metal shielding. The International Space Station is protected by Whipple shields, a design concept developed by American astronomer Fred Whipple in the 1940s. A Whipple shield consists of a thin outer bumper plate separated by a gap from the main pressure hull. When a micrometeoroid hits the outer plate, it and the plate material are fragmented and melted by the impact energy, spreading the debris cloud across the gap. By the time this debris cloud reaches the inner hull, its energy is distributed over a much larger area, reducing the likelihood of penetration. The ISS has been hit numerous times. Windows have had to be replaced due to impact damage. In 2016, a 7mm chip was discovered in one of the ISS cupola windows, caused by a tiny fragment, possibly a paint fleck or metal shard, traveling at orbital velocity. In 2021, the Canadarm2 robotic arm sustained visible damage from a micrometeoroid or debris impact, with a puncture hole visible in one of the boom segments. In deep space beyond Earth orbit, the risk from orbital debris, which is human-generated material in orbit, essentially disappears, but natural micrometeoroids remain. The density of micrometeoroids varies across the solar system. It is higher, closer to the Sun, and in certain regions like the asteroid belt. For a Mars transit, the probability of a catastrophic impact during any single mission is calculated to be low. But low is not zero, and over the course of a 2.5 to 3 year mission, the cumulative probability increases. A hull breach caused by a micrometeoroid in deep space would result in rapid decompression. On the ISS, a small leak can be detected and patched, and emergency evacuation to Earth is possible. In deep space, the crew would have to detect, locate, and repair the breach using only onboard supplies, while potentially dealing with the physiological effects of pressure loss, or without any external assistance. Solar storms represent perhaps the most acute life-threatening event that could occur during a deep space mission. We discussed solar particle events earlier in the context of chronic radiation exposure, but a major solar storm, one on the scale of the great events that have been recorded in history, poses a risk of acute radiation sickness and death within hours. The Sun's activity follows an approximately 11-year cycle, with periods of maximum activity called solar maximum, during which solar flares and coronal mass ejections are most frequent and intense. During solar maximum, the likelihood of a major solar particle event is highest, though significant events can occur at any point in the solar cycle. A coronal mass ejection directed toward a spacecraft in deep space would arrive between several hours and a few days after the eruption, depending on its speed. The fastest CMEs can traverse the Earth-Sun distance in less than a day. When the CME arrives, it brings with it a shockwave of accelerated protons and heavier ions. The dose rate during a major event can exceed the normal background GCR dose rate by factors of hundreds or thousands. In deep space, with no magnetosphere to deflect the particles and no thick atmosphere to absorb them, the crew would receive the full brunt of the particle storm. The primary mitigation strategy currently envisioned for solar particle events is a storm shelter, a small, heavily shielded compartment within the spacecraft where the crew would retreat during a solar storm. The shelter might use water tanks, polyethylene blocks, or other hydrogen-rich materials arranged around a small habitable space. The idea is that while the rest of the spacecraft might offer inadequate protection against the intense SPE radiation, the concentrated shielding of the storm shelter would reduce the dose to survivable levels. But building an effective storm shelter adds mass and volume. The warning time for a solar event can be limited. The most energetic particles from a solar flare, those traveling at close to the speed of light, arrive at the spacecraft just minutes after the flare is observed. The slower bulk of the particle storm follows, but those initial minutes are crucial. If crew members are in the middle of an EVA when a flare occurs, they need to get inside and to the shelter within minutes. Now, let us talk about something that is not often discussed in popular descriptions of deep space travel, but is critically important for any mission that involves setting foot on another world: the toxicity of extraterrestrial dust. The Moon and Mars are both covered in a fine, powdery material called regolith. This regolith is fundamentally different from soil or dust on Earth. On Earth, rocks and soil particles are weathered over millions of years by wind, water, and biological activity, rounding their edges and coating them in layers of oxidized minerals. The Moon has no wind, no water, and no biology. Lunar regolith particles are created by micrometeoroid impacts that shatter the surface rock, producing fragments that are sharp, jagged, angular, and covered in a layer of extremely reactive nanophase metallic iron. During the Apollo missions, astronauts tracked lunar dust into the lunar module after their surface excursions. Despite the short duration of their surface stays, which lasted no more than about 3 days, several astronauts reported irritated eyes, scratchy throats, and what Apollo 17 astronaut Harrison Schmitt famously described as lunar hay fever. Schmitt, a geologist and the only scientist to walk on the Moon, reported nasal congestion and throat irritation that lasted for hours after exposure to lunar dust in the cabin. The lunar module's air filtration system was not designed to handle the fine, electrostatically charged particles, which clung to spacesuits, equipment, and every surface.